Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second in our summer webinar series here at the PSEO Coalition, working with PSEO Geographic Flows Data, where graduates go and what it means. I'm Gina Johnson. I serve as director of the PSEO, or Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes Coalition. And I first want to orient you is where we are in terms of our summer webinar series. So if we could Perfect. If we can go to slide 3. We started with our first webinar in June. And this one was focused on our earnings data, which is a huge part of the PSEO data set. People use that data a lot. But we also wanted to highlight the other aspects of the PSEO data. So you can see right now today's topic, geographic flows data. And then in August, we will be focusing on industry data. And so we want you to know that each of these is recorded. When you entered the room, you probably heard that there's a recording in session. We will be posting these, and the June 25th one is already posted on our website. So if you go to pseocoalition.org/webinars, you can access the recorded versions from the June. And in case you have to hop out or you want to share what you hear today with a colleague, the July version will be posted as well by next week. So in case this is your first time orienting yourself or attending something from PSEO or the PSEO Coalition, I want to just really quickly, in 2 slides, very briefly, orient you to what it is that we are. So this first slide is a map of all of the states plus Washington, D.C. Western Governors University is also a member. They're hard to put on a map because they're all over the place. They're an online institution. And so I just wanted to orient you to the fact that we started more than 10 years ago as an idea from someone at the University of Texas system who wanted to find data on University of Texas institution graduates who had left the state of Texas. They had great data inside Texas. If folks stayed in Texas to work, they didn't have very good data, zero data actually, on anyone who left the state of Texas to work. And so they contacted the US Census because they knew they probably had data like this. And lo and behold, they did. They agreed to partner. It's not as easy as that. They spent a long time, a year, lots of hard work, but to our benefit, we now have this great data set that different states, different entities, different systems, consortia of private colleges, individual institutions that have joined. And we now are represented we have institutions in more than 39 states. That includes Washington, D.C., Western Governors University. And we have more than 1,000 institutions in the data set. So chances are pretty good an institution you work at or institution you are connected to is in the data set at this time. Then I'll tell you what the PSEO Coalition is about. So the PSEO, when we say PSEO or PSEO data set, that is run by our partners at the US Census. They're amazing. They're phenomenal. We love working with them. Now we turn it over to the PSEO Coalition. This is just that, a coalition of all of the, I say entities, that means systems, state agencies, consortia, sometimes individual institutions, if they have a data sharing agreement directly with the US Census who participate in this. We have some resources from Strata Education Foundation, Gates Foundation. In fact, Strata Education Foundation provided the funding for us to provide these webinars, so we're very grateful to them and their support. And we are a coalition of all of those folks who are very concerned about PSEO data, very excited about PSEO data. And our goal is to ensure that folks know about it and are able to use the data. And so before I turn it over to our webinar speaker today, a presenter, I want to share one piece of good news. If anyone has been following along, last month in June, the Department of Commerce put out an order that disallowed the type of privacy tool called noise infusion that is used to create the PSEO data set. And so for a time, for the last 2 months, we've kind of been on hold. We still have the data. They are still live and available, but we weren't sure when the next round of data, because we were expecting an update the end of June, we weren't sure when those next round of data were going to be available. And we heard yesterday, very, very good news that they have gotten, our colleagues at Census have gotten the go-ahead to update the data. So very exciting. We are expecting that update to come in the end of August, and we'll alert the community via LinkedIn and other ways when those data go live. But we're very excited and we're very pleased that we will have new data, especially the 5 new states that are expecting data that will be coming in August. So then we really are going to reach, I think, if I'm quoting correctly, 1,117 institutions by the end of August will be in the new data set. So we're very excited about that. So on that piece of good news, and thank you for celebrating that with us, I am going to turn it over. If we go one more slide to introduce Christopher Pena, Dr. Christopher Pena, he wears so many hats. He's not wearing a hat today physically, but he wears very many virtual, metaphorical hats. The reason we love Christopher is he is the PSEO Coalition's data literacy partner, and he also supervises our student interns because he has a wonderful connected background. He is a professor of the practice at the University of Denver. He is also formerly very involved in institutional research, strategic planning, those kinds of big administrative things that post-secondary folks are thinking about. So he really understands that sweet spot of how to teach folks stuff, which is exactly what he's going to do today, and how to think about how we use data at the institutional system and state agency level to make decisions. So I'm going to turn it over to Christopher. Welcome and thank you. As you have questions, please place them in the chat. We're pretty informal here. We don't have a separate Q&A box, but please place those questions in the chat. My colleague Annika and I will be raising those questions up to Christopher as we go, and we will also save some time at the end for a set of questions. So don't forget them, just type them in. Turn it over to you, Christopher. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully some of you were able to attend our first session earlier last month, and you got a peek at the earnings data, which are one of the larger parts of the PSEO data set. And today we're going to switch gears just a little bit and focus on the second major component, which is our geographic flows information. And as the name suggests, it tells us about geography, where our graduates go after they complete their program. I'll talk a little bit more about the data set itself in just a little bit. But in terms of goals, just setting the stage for what I hope to accomplish for you today, I'd like you to walk away with a structured framework to understand the PSEO geographic flows data. They're a little bit different from the earnings data in several features. So it's important to understand how they differ so that you can use them effectively and with confidence. I also want you to understand some of the key limitations of the data. There's so many opportunities for rich analysis, but at the same time, we also need to keep in mind some of the limitations, just like the earnings data, as we're doing our analysis and sharing our findings with our stakeholders. I'd also like you to be able to contextualize what you're seeing, to think about the context of the data in the larger PSEO ecosystem. And with that understanding, being able to report what you discover responsibly to your audience members. So to get us started, let's think about a question that would lead us to the PSEO data set. Now, the PSEO data this data set are focused around geographic flows. So let's start with the data themselves, and then we'll move into how we might study them. As Gina mentioned earlier, the PSEO data set is produced by the U.S. Census Bureau in partnership with institutions and state agencies from across the country. And it measures where students go geographically, where they're employed after graduation, 1, 5, and 10 years after completion, just like the earnings give us those quartiles 1, 5, and 10 years after graduation. They're pulled from both institution-level data and from state uninsurance wage records. So we get a really good coverage across the country about where students are going and what kind of work they're doing. We have the ability to slice the information by state, by institution, by degree level, by program, which is based on the zip code or the classification of instructional programs, touch on that in just a minute, and ultimately by cohort. So you may know from the earnings data that our data, in order to protect privacy, are grouped into cohorts of several years. So there are 3-year cohorts and 5-year cohorts, 3-year for bachelor's and 5-year for other degree levels. And that has important implications for us as we think about how to use the data. And ultimately, the geographic flows data report the number of students who are employed either in the state of the institution that they graduated from or in another census division. There's some nuances there that we'll explore today. I also want to point out that the geographic flows data are actually married with the industry flows data in the PSEO data set. That has implications for the file size, as I'll mention in just a minute. But we're going to talk today specifically about geography, geographic data. In our next webinar, we'll switch to our industry data. If you're interested to learn more about the methodology, how the data are created, some of those nuances, I've included a link on this slide to the PSEO documentation website. And as Gina mentioned, our slide deck will be made available to you after the webinar, so you can click that link to learn more information. Now, if you're familiar with the PSEO data, maybe your entry point was the PSEO Explorer, which is that website that allows us to engage with PSEO data graphically through the US Census Bureau. This is an image of what the PSEO Explorer looks like on the Geographic Flows page. And it's very similar to the earnings page in terms of the setup. On the upper left, you've got filters that allow you to narrow down, as I mentioned, to the state or the institution, the degree level, and so on. Then you can select some different features about what you want to see, geography or industry, 1 year, 5 year, 10 years after graduation. You can toggle between the count and the percentages, whichever makes the most sense for your analysis. At the bottom, you can see the program of study. Now, here's an important fact to remember about the geographic flows data. Unlike the earnings data, which has both 2 and 4-digit zip codes for certain levels of programs, with the geographic flows, we only have the 2-digit zip code. Remember, that's the high-level family or program of study in the classification system for the federal government. So what that means is we lose some nuance and granularity in our data set, but we can still do some rich analysis, as I hope to show you today. Now, the center stage at the top is where you see a Sankey diagram or a ribbon diagram that allows you to understand the flow of, in this case, health professions graduates. We're starting out with about 19,000 students, and we're looking at where they go, where they work after graduation. And it looks like about 17,000, as we're going to see today, a good majority of those students are staying in Colorado. About 564 are in the mountain region outside of Colorado, and then the rest are distributed in different areas of the country. You may be familiar, if you're looking at those labels, these are US Census Bureau divisions. So there are 9 divisions in the United States, and every state falls into a different division. And so that's the way that we get the information from PSEO. Currently, we don't have the state level information outside of the state of the institution that the student graduated from. Did they stay in that same state? So if, for example, a student who graduated in Colorado moved to New York, we would only know that they moved into the northern part of the country, not specifically that they moved to New York. So we do have to keep that in mind as we're working with the data. Okay, so now we understand a little bit about the data set itself. Let's think about questions that we could ask using this information. If you attended our first webinar this summer, you may remember that we decided to look at health professions graduates as a specific population for analysis. And I thought it might be good to carry that conversation forward because there are some interesting findings from our last conversation that inform our conversation today. If you didn't attend the last webinar, no problem. I'm not going to hold that against you, and there's nothing new today that's going to put you behind. But if you did attend that first webinar, then you're going to understand pretty well what we're talking about today. So we decided in that conversation that we were interested in health professions graduates. Those are coded under zip code 51. And we wanted to look specifically at students who received an associate's degree because that's an entry-level credential for the majority of health professions students. And we also wanted to look at Colorado specifically, a little selfishly. That's where I live and work, so it makes sense to use that as an example. In this context, let's think about those health professions graduates. We want to know, where did they go after they completed their program? And with that information, what does that tell us about talent pipelines, student mobility, and institutional reach? These are big questions, but we can actually do a good job of answering them using the PSEO data. Now, before we begin, we need to think about our questions analytically. We've got some big inquiry areas, but we need to transform that into something that we can actually analyze. So we have a wide variety of ways that we could tackle this problem, but I think there are 3 main ways that we could do it. One is we could ask, does in-state retention hold steady or erode over time? Do those students who stay in-state tend to leave at the 5 and 10-year point after their first year? We might also ask, does program portability and licensure shape whether students leave? Now, to be clear, the goal is not to make a causal claim. We simply don't have the information to draw inferences about that relationship. But we do know that certain kinds of credentials carry licensure requirements, or they tend to be portable or transferable to other states. And maybe that informs our interpretation of the findings. And then finally, we maybe want to look at geography relative to a state. Does geographic movement matter differently from one state to another state? So, three different ways that we can tackle those big questions. We'll talk through some other considerations and then we'll circle back to those questions before we get into the analysis itself. And my goal here today is to show you what's possible and hopefully to inspire you about some ideas about how you can use the data for similar kinds of questions. Now, first up, we need to decide how are we going to analyze from an aggregation perspective. As you may know from PSEO data, there are built-in aggregations of those slices that I mentioned earlier, like totals by state, totals by institution, total by degree level, and so on. So we have a wide variety of aggregated information already built in the PSEO data set. Now, for our questions, we can use some of the raw data, but we may also need to do our own aggregations for our purposes. So I think there are a few things that we should pursue in order to complete this analysis. First off, if we want to do a national level analysis, what's happening across the PSEO ecosystem relative to the data, we don't have that in the PSEO data set itself, but we can use the institution level records to aggregate up to the national level. I personally recommend using the institution level records instead of the state level records for this, because with the state level, you're aggregating on top of an aggregation, and that muddies the waters quite a bit. The good news for aggregations with the flows data, both geographic and industry, is that we're dealing with raw counts. Some of them are suppressed for privacy reasons, but it's unlike the quartiles in the earnings data set, which makes aggregation, custom aggregation, a little bit gray. We have to interpret it with caution if we do, for example, a weighted average of our values. But with this data, we simply have the counts. So we can add them up, we can do weighted averages, things like that, whatever makes sense for our questions. I do think we can use the state roll-up records for state level rankings. They're already ready to go, so why not use those? And we could also use those same state level records to study Colorado specifically as our anchor state. Here's a big caveat to remember with the PSEO geographic data. The aggregations themselves often include a total row in that aggregation. So for example, all institutions in the state, or all degree levels, or all cohorts. And when you're dealing with those aggregations, you want to make sure you exclude them from your analysis because obviously they would skew the data and your interpretation if the aggregation is included alongside the subgroups that are part of that aggregation. So just watch out for that. There are some dummy codes that are used to easily spot these. For example, 00 is a fake zip code for all instructional programs, or 0000 is a number for all cohorts as opposed to a particular year of a cohort. We also have to think about how low do we want to go with our geographic analysis? How are we going to understand placement and movement after completion? Given the data structure that we have, there are three main ways that we can analyze this. We can look at the graduates who are employed in the same state as the institution that they graduated from. We can look at those who moved to a different state in the same census division. And then finally, we can look at those who are employed in a completely different census division entirely. As I mentioned earlier, all of these data are based around the in-state or the in-state institution that they graduated from, and then the US Census Bureau designations, or those 9 census divisions across the country. We can also think about how can we compare health professions against other programs to better understand their patterns. I think that's often useful for context. Now, of course, this is a synthetic situation, but let's pretend that we were interested in examining whether or not different kinds of credentials with different portability profiles would help us to understand the movement of our health professions graduates. So I chose a few fields that painted a slightly different picture from different lenses that I think make sense for this analysis. When we think about things like high credential portability, you can easily move from one state to the other and find employment with your degree. We could choose fields like business or computer and information sciences. Now, of course, keep in mind that certain fields like business, like accounting or finance may have credentialing that does vary state to state. But on the whole, if you get a degree in management or marketing, you can translate that to any other state in the country. Likewise with computer and information sciences. On the other side, we have low credential portability, which would include something like education. Again, the education zip code family includes a wide array of different education-related fields. So you might have early childhood education, special education, educational licensure for principals, and so on. And so, of course, those credentials are more nuanced. Some of them are portable, some of them are not. But on the whole, they tend to be less portable because they are tailored to a particular state's standards and requirements. So these are the fields that I think we're going to compare our data against to better understand health professions graduates. With all of that in mind, that leads us back to about three simple questions that I think we can answer using the PSEO data. First, how does in-state retention trend for health professions compared to other programs, including those with different portability profiles? Do we see a similar or divergent trajectory? Second, at year one, because we do need to limit our analysis, what's the full geographic split and how does it vary by program? Do students stay in state? Do they stay in the same division or do they move to a different division? And then finally, because Colorado is our anchor state for this example, how does Colorado compare to other states in retaining its own graduates and where specifically do the ones who leave end up? So I think that's a reasonable set of questions for this particular data set. Before we get into the analysis, let's go a little bit deeper with the data because there are some special considerations for the PSEO data. Now, just like with our earnings data, I chose to use Python to do the analysis, although you can do this in other tools as well. Now, the data themselves are coming from the US Census Bureau, the PSEO website. You can download the raw data files. So we're pulling in the national data set for all of the states and the DC and Western Governors University in one single data set as a CSV file, comma separated values file. We're combining that with a list of zip codes and labels to get the word descriptions for our fields of study. And we're also combining the data set with a list of institutions with their names and locations so we can get some of that information about the school that the student graduated from. When you download the CSV data files from the PSEO website, they don't include the labels, they just include the quantitative measures and the codes for the labels. So you often have to combine it with the qualitative information to get the labels for those codes. And the good news is those are all available through the PSEO website. As a side note, along with this presentation, when it's posted on the PSEO Coalition website, we'll also share the Python script that was used to pull down the data, prepare it, and analyze it. So you have that as a template to do your own analysis. Now, you may notice at the bottom, we've got about 42 million raw rows that are in the original data set. That's a lot of data, and oftentimes I can't even open it in Excel, even as a CSV file. So that's another reason that you may want to consider Python or R, or even a visualization tool like Tableau or Power BI to interact with the data, because the data are just so large, even in their stripped down, non-formatted version, that you may not be able to open them in a traditional analysis tool. But the good news is after filtering down to our target population, we had about 370,000 records, which is much more manageable. Most of those records are institution level records and a smaller number are state level records. Now, this is a map of the US Census divisions. You can see in red, I'm located in the mountain region, and then all the others are spread across the country. So this is important for us to understand. You can identify where a student graduated, where they graduated from, and then where they were employed after graduation. So when I talk about where they went or where they go, we're really saying specifically where were they employed after graduation. This gets a little bit muddy when you're dealing with certain parts of the country, like the Northeast, where many people commute across state borders. So they may work in one state, but they may live in the state next door. Just keep that in mind compared to, say, the West, where there's much larger state areas, and so there's less geographic movement from a commuting perspective. Now, the geographic split is a little bit tricky to handle with the raw data. Remember that we have breakouts or counts by the census division. And what you see on the right is what you would see in the raw data with the labels added to it. So each census division has its own record. This is narrowed down for associates, for health profession students for Colorado. And what we can see is that in red, down at the bottom, the Mountain Division had about 17,000 graduates, 17,652. And of those 17,000 were in state after graduation. But we have to put a larger context on this and step back just a little bit. If I look to the very first row, national states, 50 states plus DC, the total number of graduates from this subset, Colorado, is about 19,000, and of them, 17,000 remained in state after graduation. 48 moved to the New England division, 100 moved to Middle Atlantic, and so on. So the division level records sum up to the national level record. You can see those numbers add up to that top level aggregation. The challenge here is that we have to take this record structure and translate it into those three geographic splits. They stayed in state, same census division but different state, and another census division. So we're going to really key in on the census division of the state of interest, in this case, Colorado. And then we're going to tease that apart in order to create some new records. We're going to take that census division record for Mountain Division and break it apart into two new records that replace the original one. We're going to use the number of graduates who are employed in that division and the number of graduates who are employed in state specifically. So we'll tease those apart to get the actual raw counts for our analysis. Again, that'll be included in the Python script if you want to take a deeper dive into how we do that from a data management perspective. Now, this process can be a little bit complex, but the good news is it's very easily replicated. Now, an important thing to know about this is probably in your analysis, whether it's in Tableau or Power BI or Python, you may want to bring in what are called shape files. A shape file is essentially a geographic information file that uses polygons in order to create the borders for different geographic regions. Think like a state border or a country border that's encoded into a shapefile. We can combine the shape files with the PSEO data, modify the shape files to trick it into creating divisions that are actually custom made for our purposes. So we're going to take that one record for the mountain division and, as I said, break it apart. We're going to create one new record for the Colorado division, and then we're going to create a new record for the mountain balance, which is everyone else in the mountain region outside of Colorado. And then all of the other divisions stay the same. If you're interested in learning more about those shapefiles, I've included the link here to where we typically grab those on our student intern team. And it's very easy to work with. And the Python script also includes some information about how to modify that for your purposes. All right, so that's a lot of background about the data itself. Let's talk a little bit about the analysis. First off, our first question had to do with retention. We wanted to know where they start, how it changes over time, whether patterns are durable, and whether portability might help us out. So I think there are two visualizations that would serve us well here. One is we could do a trajectory line of health professions compared to all other associates majors. So looking at 1, 5, and 10 years after graduation, how does that trend? And we could do a similar visualization of health professions against our specific comparison programs, business, computer and information sciences, and education. And we'll see if those make any differences when we visualize them. This is what that first visual could look like. Again, this is generated in Python. And right away, we can see that the retention in state for our health profession students is starting very high at year 1. It's about 89%, and then it dips down to about 82% for year 10. The other associates programs are starting much lower and follow a similar trend. They started about 83% at year 1 and moved down to about 76% for year 10. And then there's about partway through at year 5. Now, some of you with eagle eyes may notice that my scale for the y-axis does not start at 0 to 100. I've zoomed in just for the sake of example here. So just keep that in mind. If we were to zoom back out to a properly scaled axis, the lines would look a little bit less angled. But for our purposes, this is helpful just to see the general trend. Now, if we wanted to compare it against our comparator programs, we see a similar pattern. It looks like for computer and information sciences, their retention is much lower at all 3 points in time, which makes sense because you can take that degree and work almost anywhere. Business, interestingly, has high in-state retention after completion. So it's starting out not too much lower than health professions. It narrows the gap at year 5 and then widens just a little bit at year 10. Now take a look at the orange line, which represents education. This is a really interesting finding. It actually surprised me when I did the analysis. Education starts with a lower in-state retention rate at year one, moves up higher at year five, and then moves back down at year 10. Now, this I think would be worthy of some additional investigation to better understand why this might be, because it's very divergent relative to the other instructional programs. So my first question would be, as an analyst, is there some artifact of the data that's influencing that pattern, or is it actually a substantive finding? So one way that we could do that is with a cohort analysis. In the PSEO data, you have the option to select either all cohorts pulled together or a specific cohort one at a time. Remember that for bachelor or for the associate's degrees, there's a 5-year cohort window. The most recent cohort that we have for this sample study for the 10-year point would be the 2006 to 2010 cohort. So that's what I mapped here against all cohorts to see if a similar pattern shaped out for health professions and education. And they're very similar to each other, specifically education. So I feel comfortable, at least for now, saying that it's not an artifact of the cohort or the data. It does appear to, in fact, be a true finding about the education program. And I'd be really curious to follow up on that. So if you're looking for some ideas for analysis, that might be a direction to consider for your own work. Now, with question two, we wanted to shift to our geographic interpretation, not just the state level information. I think for this one, a stacked bar chart would make the most sense to look at the composition of where people go in those 3-level splits by the different programs of study that we identified. And that's what this could look like. So we've got our several programs, health professions, business, other associates programs, computer information sciences, and education. And these are sorted from highest to lowest in-state retention rates. Again, health professions is coming out on top with the dark blue at 89%, and education is at the bottom with 76% in-state retention rate. The light blue, it's not labeled here for the sake of size, but that means that they stayed in the same census division, but they moved to a different state. And then finally, the gray section on the far right shows that they moved to a different census division entirely. So it looks like the students either tend to stay in state or move to another census division, and a much smaller percentage across the programs stay in the same census division but move to a different state. I think that's very helpful for us to understand what movement looks like, because if we're thinking about our regional talent pipelines, we know that we're doing a good job with this field to hold them in state, which is where we need them as health professionals. But if they're going to move, they're less likely to stay in a neighboring state in the same division. They're more likely to move somewhere else. At least that's how I interpret the information. Now, with our third question, we want to move from the national view to a state-by-state view. We want to incorporate more of that geographic lens as well. So I think there are 3 different kinds of visualizations that we can use for this analysis. First, we could do a bar chart that shows in-state retention at 1 year by state. So see how those shake out. You could also do this for 5 and 10 years after completion, but just for the sake of time today, we'll take a look at 1 year after completion. We can also create a choropleth or a filled map showing in-state retention at 1 year by state. So how does that vary geographically across the country? And then finally, we could create a choropleth showing retention specifically for Colorado. How does that look with a regional focus specifically from a visualization perspective? These are 2 visualizations that would allow us to understand that information graphically. And as you heard me say in our first webinar this summer, there are often several different ways that you can understand the data from a visualization perspective. Some people prefer bar charts and some people prefer maps. It's entirely personal preference and what makes sense for the audience that you're communicating your findings to. On the left, we have a bar chart, and we can see Colorado is shaded in red because that's the anchor state that we're interested in. The national rate overall across all of our health professions for associate's degree graduates is about 89%. So that's the dotted line that you see on the far right as a reference point. It looks like Texas is coming out on top with an outstanding 95% in-state retention for health professions associates graduates. So great job there. And then it goes down from there, and Colorado lands about in the middle of the pack. If you were with us in the first webinar where we looked at earnings for health professions, we also took a look at Colorado, and you may remember that Colorado was also mid-tier on that analysis. Now, it's interesting that it happens to be that we're in the middle of the pack for both levels of analysis, but it could just be an artifact of the data, could be a coincidence, there could be something more substantive that we want to investigate. Keep in mind that when I talk about the performance of in-state retention, that's not to say that's an effectiveness metric. It's more to just say where students are actually working after graduation. If a certain metric is good or bad for you, good or bad, then it just depends on your context. Maybe you have a target that you're trying to hit, which could be a reference line here, or maybe you're trying to improve over a past performance metric. Either way, you can analyze how that's changing over time with different cohorts. That same information is represented on the choropleth on the right. And again, you'll see Colorado is outlined in red because that's our anchor state of interest. And right away, we can see visually that Texas and New York and a few other states are coming out on top with the dark blue. As Gina mentioned at the start of our presentation, we have about 39 plus states that are a member of the PSEO Coalition and in the PSEO data. So the fact that someone is shaded in gray could mean either they're not in the coalition or we don't have sufficient data in the data set to report for this analysis. So that's something you always want to be honest with about with your stakeholders about, that it's possible that a state is part of the coalition, but for one reason or another, we just don't have sufficient data to do the analysis. So keep that in mind when you're sharing your findings with your stakeholders. Now, this is another map that shows the split with a Colorado focus, shaded in dark blue, and then just an outline of the mountain region and a legend at the bottom that tells us the breakout for Colorado specifically. So about 88 or 89% are staying in state, about 3% are staying in the mountain region outside of Colorado, and 9% are moving to other parts of the country. Of course, that's nice to know, but the next follow-up question is logically, but where exactly did they go? And that's what this map can show us. So now we're taking a look at that three-level split in state, which is Colorado in this example, the rest of the mountain region, we're in this mountain census division, and then all of the other census divisions as well. So this is a nice way, you may have seen it in some of the work that our student interns have done. This is a nice way to communicate the geography of the census divisions relative to the PSEO movement. And again, if you combine this data with the shape files from the federal government, you can create those outlines around the census divisions while maintaining your state level boundary outlines as well. Okay, that's a lot of information that we've learned from some simple analysis. What did we actually glean from all of this? Well, I think health professions graduates stay in state at a higher rate consistently than those other programs. And the gap between them doesn't change that much over 10 years. So they're coming out at a high in-state retention rate. When graduates do leave, they tend to leave the whole census division, not just cross to a nearby state. Again, that has important implications for talent pipelines and movement within different regions. Many institutions are concerned about preparing students to then leave their region. Of course, every student has their own goals. There are pressures that we can't always know. And so we want to make sure that we're holding on to those students when the talent is needed, but we also have to understand it's not always up to us what those students decide to do after completion. As I said earlier, looking at the visualizations, that bar chart of in-state retention, Colorado is fairly mid-tier, about 14th out of 26 states that were in this analysis, and Texas came out at the top, I think about 95% retention. Now, the levers in Colorado show a small pull towards the Pacific Census Division and the West-South Central Division, which makes sense. Those are very close to us geographically. So if they are going to leave to another census division, it's at least a little bit closer. Now, I say that with caution because those percentages, if you noticed, were very, very small, 1, 2, 3%. So we can't draw too hard of a conclusion from that information. So what's the bottom line? Where do graduates go? What does it tell us? Well, from all of this, we've learned health professions graduates are meaningfully more likely than their peers to stay and work in the state that trained them, and that pattern seems to hold up over the 10-year horizon. I think that's a very interesting perspective for us to take away, and the data do support that narrative based on the analysis that I've shared with you. So a few final thoughts, and then we'll pause for some questions. First off, remember that we had to make some choices about how we were going to conduct and approach our analysis. Those scoping decisions, like what is going to be your comparison group, what level of geographic analysis are you going to do, those shape how you approach the data. So you need to be thoughtful about that at the start. Make sure that you're checking coverage before you start to rank the states. As I mentioned earlier, not all of the PSEO states are reflected in the data, simply by virtue of not always having the data available for that intersection that we're studying. Make sure that you don't dismiss an odd pattern as noise. Remember, we saw that interesting finding with education where it started out low, went up high at year 5, and then went low again at year 10? I could have easily just said, well, there's something funny going on. That can't possibly be right because the other programs are showing a very different trend. But when we did the cohort analysis, we saw that in fact it does seem to hold up across those different cohorts. So I think there's something meaningful there to explore. And then finally, a single different division bucket can hide real destination patterns. Unfortunately, we can't currently say which specific state did they go to, although I believe down the road the Census Bureau is talking about that, incorporating that into the PSEO data set, which would be fantastic because then we could really do a deeper dive into exactly where they went after graduation. What can the data do and what can they not do? Here's a quick summary. The PSEO Geographic Flows data can track where our cohorts are employed 1, 5, and 10 years after graduation. So it's not necessarily where they live, it's where they're employed. It can help us distinguish in-state from same division from different division destinations. We can compare behavior across institutions, states, and programs. We have to manipulate the data a little bit, but we can do it. And then we can look at mobility and connect that to program type even without the individual micro data. So just one of the benefits of the PSEO data, earnings and geography and industry, we don't have to have the micro data. We can still draw meaningful conclusions based on those aggregations. But it can't do everything. It can't tell us why someone moved. That's, of course, very personal. It has to do with a variety of factors that we just don't capture in the quantitative information. So that may require qualitative follow-up to understand why students may be moving or leaving the state. We can't distinguish between voluntary and involuntary mobility. It's possible that someone's partner decided to take a job across the country. It's possible that they weren't able to find work in their region. So there are various reasons, as I said, why they may choose to move. Sometimes it's up to them, and sometimes it's not. We don't have the state-to-state destination right now. Hopefully down the road, that's something we might have access to. And ultimately, it doesn't tell us what those students earned once they got to their destination. We can see what they earned separate from the geography, but we can't narrow in and say specifically of this graduate population that moved to this division, what did they earn specifically? The geography and earnings data simply aren't crossed that way to allow us to answer that question. All right. I appreciate your attention to all that information. Hopefully that inspired some ideas for you. Let's pause here and see if we have any questions from the chat or anything else that's bubbled up in our conversation today.
Thank you, Christopher. We don't have any questions in the chat, so I'm going to do two things. One, give people time to place questions in the chat if you have them. I have a question for all of you, and so you would be welcome to also place answers to those questions in the chat. And then I am going to say a little bit about something that Christopher previewed, which is other data that are potentially coming. So my question for all of you to type answers to while I'm going to share some of this other stuff is, are you having pressure? Some of you are, I'm sure, from institutions, some from state agencies or systems. Do you get pressure in whatever space you're in to keep your students, whatever you define as your students, in the state or in the local area? It's one of the things we've talked a lot about with our PSEO Coalition members. There's some folks who feel a lot of pressure from, whether it be from legislators or others, blaming, perhaps, if that's, if I may use that term, the institutions themselves for maybe not keeping people in their state. So that's something I just want to, and I see 100% Kim in there. Something I want to chat about a little bit in a second.
Gina,
Yep.
it was so bad that
Yeah.
that they were talking about making students pay back TOPS if they didn't pay back scholarships if they didn't stay in the state.
Yeah.
It is 100,000 times pressure, ROI to the state on just about everything which requires staying in the state. So
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that comment, Kim, and thanks for popping into the chat with that. And I see others agreeing with this piece, which is that that's something that we've been talking about as well, is of course, the purpose of our webinars is to teach folks about the data and how the data can be used, how they can't be used, what they can't. I love that Christopher always includes that as well. This was what we can't, it can't share. And as Christopher highlighted, the PSEO data don't tell us why people leave or what would keep them, right? And so that's stuff that we have to dig in ourselves as well. And so that's something as a coalition we're really thinking a lot about, is collectively kind of doing the research in our different states and thinking about this piece. And one thing I want to highlight, and I'll put a note in the chat in a moment, is we do a series of research grants, and one of the research grants that was from this last round, and they are just being published in our resource library right now. And then also at the end, we'll share information about how you can attend another virtual learning opportunity from us. The Arizona State University partnered with the Arizona Board of Regents to do a talent stickiness analysis. And I encourage folks to look at that as well. I'll put that link in the chat. One thing I wanted to mention, Christopher mentioned it, what other data might we get? So there's a huge caveat on this right now, because as we mentioned at the beginning, we're very excited to be able to share that the new data will be published late next month. But we aren't sure how this commerce order related to privacy tools is going to impact PSEO data longer term, because we were expecting sometime in 2027 to get, as Christopher mentioned, information on exactly what state they go to. So for states like Missouri that has major cities on either side of the state that are on borders with other states, you'd be able to understand a little bit better on kind of, are they going to those states exactly, or are they going somewhere else in the region? So we're hoping still that we will get that. And another piece of the puzzle related to these questions that we're talking about here is knowing whether the graduates were in the state when they started their program. And so a lot of, flagship institutions have a lot of students come from out of state to get their degree, and then maybe we expect them to go back to the state that they came from. But we will actually, hopefully, in future iterations of PSEO, have a flag that will help us understand whether they lived in the state before they got their degree or their certification, and then whether that means they moved out of state or they stayed in state. It just has a little bit more information. Okay, Christopher, I've got a question for you from the chat while I dig up that link I was sharing. What tools do you use to manipulate the federal shape files?
So most of my manipulation is done in Python just to keep it consistent with the analysis side of the house. We have a simple script, and I'm happy to share that again with the materials after the webinar, that takes a shape file to download it, and then you do have to do a little bit of work to recode it, but it's very simple. You literally, if you're familiar, it's a data frame. It's a list of values, almost like a table. And then you just tell it for this particular state, let's say Colorado, create a new census record that represents that as a division. And then you sort of code the states that you want to be in the rest of the division as a balanced division. So I'll share that with you. You can take a closer look. I find that's the easiest because you can download the data, modify it, and then you can connect it with your data source. And then you can drop it into Tableau, for example, and it does an excellent job with mapping. So that would be my recommendation, just because it's more of a programmatic approach.
Thanks, Christopher. And my question got some folks in the chat talking. So I'm going to verbalize these, and I don't want to put pressure on you, Christopher, that you necessarily have an answer for all of these. But if you have any thoughts, as someone who's obviously been thinking about this through both preparations for this webinar, your experience with the interns analyzing these data, you are co-author on one of our reports that's coming out soon. That's going to be featured in August. So if you have any thoughts on this, let me know as well. But there's a question in the chat, I think in response to kind of our question about, are you feeling pressure to keep people in state or in your region? What are interventions that could be developed using this data to improve retention within a state? Would it be helpful if you were able to get student level detail to build interventions?
That's a great question. I can share some initial thoughts. I know that many other members here are in the institutional effectiveness space and probably have more direct experience on that problem. I think with anything with the PSEO data, making sure you communicate what the limitations are, but also the opportunities. As we saw today, there's a lot that you can glean from the data about patterns. Now, in terms of translating that to action, that's the data storytelling that many of us have been trained to do to motivate our administrators and our legislators to actually do something with that information. I do think it does necessarily require some follow-up, especially if you're at the institutional level. And you maybe notice that graduates in a certain program tend to be leaving your state or tend to be staying in state. Maybe those are interesting findings for you. But you may need to dig in a little bit deeper to figure out, well, why are they moving? And then that's part of the story that you're trying to tell. As I touched on just a little bit with credential portability, that can help us tell part of the story. But remember, we're dealing at the two-digit zip code level. So, for example, health professions includes doctors and dental hygienists and a variety of other fields under the umbrella of health professions, and they all have their own profiles. So it can get a little bit muddy. You have to be cautious about how far you can stretch that. But I do think using supplemental information to tell the story alongside the PSEO data is probably the best approach to then figure out, well, then if we're concerned about this, how do we intervene to retain our students or whatever our goals happen to be? That's the way that I would probably tackle it, but I think others probably have more direct experience with that problem.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christopher. That was a really thoughtful answer. And I'll just add to it, not from my own knowledge, but also to mention that the link that I provided in the chat to the Arizona project that was funded by a PSEO Coalition grant, they tackled a bit of that in there as well. And they have, in addition to sort of the dashboard of information or data that they shared and the research report, they also have some examples of how they've talked about the results of this report or preparing kind of talking points. In their case, through the Arizona Board of Regents to the legislature. Some of you may not be talking directly to the legislature from where you're sitting. It may be more talking to, a system office or to your equivalent of a board of regents or a commission on higher education or whatever it's called in your state. But that's a resource as well. So I appreciate that, Christopher. I have a question in the chat that I think I'm going to kind of combine two questions and just ask sort of in general. And then if I'm not getting it right, Kristen, I'll give you a heads up that it's yours. If you are able to and willing to, after I ask this, come off mute to clarify a little bit more. But Christopher, can you talk a little bit more about, or not a little bit more, but a little bit, I guess a little bit more from last summer's webinar series, where you talked about pulling the data using the API. Is there anything different that folks should keep in mind, or is that kind of fit with all of that you've presented today as well?
That's a great question. Thanks for raising that. Everything that I talked about today is having to do with the CSV or the Excel files that you can download directly from the PSEO Explorer website or from their companion documentation. I tend to use the CSV files because they're smaller, they're more portable, they're easily imported into something like Python, and just because of the volume of data, they make a little bit more sense. But as I talked about in last summer's webinar, there's also an API that you can use. That's a tool that allows you to dynamically connect to a data source that's available online and pull down just the data that you specifically need. So for example, let's say I just wanted to look at the state of Colorado and specifically bachelor's students. Maybe that was relevant for my analysis. I could build an API query that incorporates the state of Colorado, the degree level, I think it's 0.5 for bachelor's degrees, and then I could pull down just the data that I care about through a download process. There are two main ways that you can do that. If you've gone to the PSEO Explorer website, you may have noticed in your URL bar, there's that long string of characters and numbers with question marks. Those are actually the API parameters that's calling the data to display inside of the PSEO Explorer. That's one way you can do that. The other way, which is what the student interns and I do for other projects, is you can request an API key from the US Census Bureau. It's free. It takes like 5 minutes to get it back to you. And then in your code, like a Python code, you basically make a call to that API destination. You have to use your key. It's kind of like a permission to get the data. And then you can drag it down into a data frame or export it into an Excel file, however you decide you want to work with it. The big caveat to remember with that, and I can share I think it should be posted actually with the materials from last year, but we can also include a link to that in this webinar's materials. With that, what you'll see is you can only combine a certain number of filters together. So unfortunately, if you have a really complex sample that you're trying to define, like we did today, associate's degrees and health professions, and for a specific cohort, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to do that. It's not that it's impossible, it's just a little bit hard because of the way the API is set up. And I should say it's not the census API, it's just how APIs work in particular. So that's one thing I would just keep in mind. The interns and I are actually exploring for different tools. Do we want to download the data and use that in our visualization software like Tableau or Power BI? Or do we actually want to switch to a dynamic API, which means the file for the workbook is much smaller because there's not any data stored in it, and it just calls down what you need when you need it. The trade-off is if that site goes down or it's not available, you've lost your connection to the data. So there are trade-offs there, but it's definitely worth exploring, and it's a great way to automate your processes.
Thanks so much, Christopher. That's fantastic and really helpful. And thanks to all of you for your questions. At this point in time, with just a couple minutes left, I want to highlight what's coming next. So we have a slide with a QR code. If you have not yet registered for our August webinar, that will be once again very well presented by Christopher. This one, we're going to look at the industry data, and Christopher's going to talk a little bit about kind of how all these data connect or don't connect, as he did today, and how we can't always connect the different pieces. But what we called in general the flows data includes both the geographic flows and the industry flows. So this will be a really tight connection here to what you learned today. So if you have not yet registered for that one, the QR code is there. You can also, if you don't catch it really quickly, you can always go to pseocoalition.org/webinars. And then if you don't mind going to the next slide, Christopher, I also want to highlight our 2026 research showcase. This is a 2-hour session with a break in the middle, but this one is very exciting. We'll be featuring the 6 award winners of our PSEO Coalition research grants, as well as a presentation on a research project done by Christopher Pena, with our co-author for him was Jason Simon, who is also connected and works with us here at the PSEO Coalition. And so we'll have 7 research projects that are going to be featured in that showcase. And so I'm going to we'll leave that one up in case folks want to use that QR code. I'll just mention really quickly, and I see your hand up, Kristen, so one sec. Just want to mention for others who have to scoot off to another meeting, we will have the recording of this as well as the slides, so you'll be able to access all these materials. We have some resources at the last slide as well. You'll be able to access those. Again, pseocoalition.org/webinars. It should be up within the next week.